pockets. They were a strange, ill-assorted group. Walking in the middle, the tall, thin colonel towered over his two companions. His pale blue eyes were almost opaque, revealing nothing of the man inside, and his long, aquiline nose gave him an ascetic look that seemed oddly at variance with his uniform. And yet he carried himself with an air of natural authority that made it obvious that he was the man in charge. On the colonel's right, Sergeant Ritter was far more clearly a military man, with his clipped black moustache and polished shoes and buttons. He was a big man, and he had begun to sweat in the evening heat. But he didn't complain. He knew that they had work to do. Looking past the colonel, Ritter glared over at Corporal Carson, who was walking with a deliberate swagger, swaying his narrow hips and shoulders as he expertly flicked a piece of chewing gum from one side of his mouth to the other in time with each step he took. The young man's disrespect disgusted Ritter, but he kept his peace. Carson had been the only soldier he could find to do the job. He'd have to do. They walked past green, stony fields and rows of overgrown vines until they came to a fork in the drive and passed an old sign on which someone had once upon a time painted the words "Propriété privée." It was nailed to the trunk of a plane tree, and Carson read it out loud in his Cockney accent and laughed like it was some kind of joke. But the colonel ignored him. He had other things on his mind. One more turning, and the trees stopped suddenly on both sides, and there was the house. It was much smaller than Ritter had expected, not his idea of a chateau at all. The glass was broken in several of the small windows that appeared at regular intervals in the stone facade, and the guttering was hanging loose from one corner of the roof. Over to the left, a solitary black and white cow stood in the shade of a primitive lean-to. Her great red tongue was lolling out of her mouth, and she had clearly been suffering in the afternoon heat. It was unusual for the time of year, and Ritter wondered inconsequentially whether she was aware of the lake that stretched out like a sheet of black glass several hundred yards beyond the house. On the far shore, the town of Margent shimmered in the distance. The church stood on a ridge above the chateau, and it was clearly the more impressive of the two buildings. Even Ritter could sense its antiquity. The bell tower glowed silver in the translucent evening light, and the gargoyles, devils and apes with deformed backs and monstrous faces, gaped down at the world below. There had been devils here already, German devils, but they seemed to have left the church well alone. A swastika flag hung limply from a pole standing near the corner of the house, and a litter of papers on the dried-up lawn bore witness to the suddenness of the Germans' departure. But their hosts had remained behind, and Henri Rocard and his wife were already standing in the doorway of their house when the 3 British soldiers came out of the trees and walked across the grass toward them. It was the colonel who did the talking, and Ritter understood almost none of it, but then again he didn't need to. He knew already that the colonel wanted something from these people, and he was here to help the colonel get it, if the colonel needed help. Back at the camp outside Moitié, Cade had already explained that he was prepared to pay good money for what he wanted. More than the thing was worth. It was Rocard who was being unreasonable. Ritter didn't like the look of the Frenchman. He was thick and short, built like one of those middleweights that Ritter had gone to watch in Nottingham when he was a boy. And his dark eyes were small, staring out suspiciously from his wrinkled face. He had probably not yet turned 50, but the sun had burnt his skin to a pale leather, aging him beyond his years. Madame Rocard seemed to be a little older than her husband, but she remained an attractive woman. She stood up straight, and her black hair was pulled back severely from her well-shaped face. She was full-breasted and defiant, and Ritter would have liked to have pushed her back into the cool interior of her house, down onto the red flagstones in the hall, and fucked her until he'd had his fill. They were collaborators, and they deserved everything that